A turning point in global trade, the fall of an empire? For decades, the United States has wielded its economic dominance like a hammer, shaping global trade policies to its will. Washington dictated terms, allies followed, and adversaries fell in line, or faced the crushing weight of American tariffs. The world had grown accustomed to this reality. Trade wars? Just another power play by the White House. But what happens when those once loyal allies refuse to play the game? This time, it's different. When Donald Trump announced a fresh wave of tariffs on steel and aluminum, the world expected outcry, but not defiance. A 25% tariff on steel and a tightening grip on aluminum imports sent shockwaves through global markets. Business leaders braced for impact, and trade partners scrambled to negotiate exemptions. But in a move that has left Washington stunned, Canada, America's most trusted trade partner, did not beg for relief. Instead, it made a decision no one saw coming. It turned away from the United States. It reached for Europe. And in doing so, it may have just set off a chain reaction that could cripple one of America's most valuable industries, its auto sector. A betrayal or a necessary evolution? For years, Canada and the US have been deeply intertwined. The economies of Detroit and Ontario have functioned as one, their factories humming in harmony, supplying each other with materials, labor, and technology. When Trump imposed tariffs in 2018, Canada played the role of the patient ally, negotiating under pressure and eventually securing exemptions. But history doesn't repeat itself, it evolves. This time, Canada refused to be a pawn. Instead of waiting for Washington to dictate terms, it took a radical step, strengthening ties with the European Union, shifting its trade alliances away from the US, and creating a safety net that threatens to make American industries irrelevant in the long run. Why does this matter? Because steel and aluminum are not just raw materials. They are the backbone of America's $1.5 trillion auto industry. If Canada stops supplying these critical materials, or worse, redirects them exclusively to the EU, American car manufacturers will face soaring production costs, supply shortages, and devastating job losses. An economic fallout no one expected. Washington assumed Canada had no choice but to comply. After all, where else could it go? The answer was waiting across the Atlantic. By aligning more closely with Europe, Canada has secured a trade lifeline that bypasses the US entirely. And it's not just about metals. The EU and Canada have deepened their commitment to critical mineral supply chains, ensuring that Europe, not America, benefits from Canada's vast natural resources. This means that while American automakers struggle with rising material costs and new trade barriers, their European counterparts could gain a competitive edge, accessing cheaper, tariff-free resources from Canada. But this isn't just an economic shift, it's a political statement. Canada's decision to pivot away from Washington is a direct rejection of US trade policies and an assertion of its economic independence. The message is clear. If the US chooses protectionism, its closest allies will find new paths forward. Without it, is America ready for the consequences? The United States has long relied on its trade supremacy to dictate global economic rules. But what happens when its partners decide to push back? When the supply chains that fuel its industries are no longer within reach? The collapse of the US auto industry might sound unthinkable, but so did the idea of Canada turning its back on Washington. And yet, here we are. This isn't just about steel, aluminum, or tariffs. This is about a power shift, a global realignment, and perhaps, the beginning of an era where America is no longer the center of the economic world. What happens next? The full story of how Canada's shocking move could reshape global trade, and why Washington might not be able to stop it, is just beginning. What do you think? Will this decision strengthen Canada or push the US into deeper economic turmoil? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for the latest updates on this unfolding global shift. The trade war that no one expected. Keycap 1: The United States strikes first, but Canada refuses to play along. For decades, the United States and Canada have been deeply interconnected in trade, particularly in manufacturing and raw material supply chains. The two nations share one of the world's largest bilateral trading relationships. And the seamless movement of goods across their borders has been the foundation of industries ranging from aerospace to automobiles. That relationship, however, took a dramatic turn when former U.S. President Donald Trump reintroduced sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum, slapping a 25% tax on steel imports and an additional yet-to-be-disclosed tariff on aluminum. The move was framed as an effort to protect American industry, but its implications were far more complex. Trump didn't stop there. He also hinted at a reciprocal tariff policy, meaning any country imposing high duties on American goods would face equal retaliation. This was a direct challenge to nations like Canada and the European Union, which have long relied on free trade agreements with the U.S. to sustain economic stability. The world braced for a familiar cycle: tariffs imposed, followed by negotiations, minor concessions, and a return to business as usual. But this time, Canada refused to play the same game. Instead of pleading for exemptions, Ottawa found a new way forward, one that would reshape the global balance of power. Keycap 2: Canada's radical move, breaking free from U.S. dependence. When Trump first imposed tariffs in 2018, Canada responded with targeted countermeasures, imposing retaliatory duties on American products like bourbon, motorcycles, and agricultural goods. But those measures were designed to pressure the U.S. back to the negotiating table. This time, Canada's response was far more strategic. Instead of retaliating with temporary tariffs, Canada shifted its trade focus entirely. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced an unprecedented expansion of Canada's economic partnership with the European Union, effectively reducing Canada's reliance on the U.S. market. The move wasn't just about finding new buyers for Canadian raw materials, it was about building an entirely new economic framework that didn't require American approval. Key elements of this shift included accelerating CETA, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, between Canada and the EU, making it easier for Canadian businesses to export goods to Europe. Cutting incentives for American manufacturers operating in Canada, instead pushing investments into domestic industries. Redirecting raw materials, particularly steel, aluminum, and critical minerals, toward European industries instead of U.S. markets. This wasn't just a trade maneuver, it was an economic realignment. By securing new trade routes with Europe, Canada sent a clear message: Washington is no longer the only game in town. Keycap 3: The ripple effect, how Canada's shift could devastate the U.S. auto industry. At first glance, some in Washington dismissed Canada's move as political posturing, an attempt to exert pressure but ultimately inconsequential in the long run. But those assumptions ignored a critical reality. Canada isn't just another trade partner, it is the backbone of the U.S. auto industry. Consider this. Small diamond: over 80% of U.S. aluminum imports come from Canada. Without that supply, American automakers will have no choice but to source materials elsewhere, at significantly higher costs. Small diamond: the North American auto supply chain is deeply integrated. Automakers in Detroit rely on Canadian factories in Ontario for everything from engine parts to vehicle frames. A disruption in that supply chain means delays, cost spikes, and ultimately, lost jobs. Small diamond: even American cars are technically Canadian. Many vehicles assembled in the U.S. contain a high percentage of Canadian manufactured parts. If those materials get rerouted to the EU instead of the U.S., the entire pricing model for American-made cars collapses. If Canada withdraws its support from the U.S. auto supply chain, it will wreak havoc on American manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, all of whom rely on stable, cost-effective materials to maintain production efficiency. Even worse, European automakers will now have access to cheaper Canadian materials, giving them a competitive edge over their American counterparts. In short, American car prices will rise due to supply chain disruptions. U.S. automakers will lose their price advantage against European competitors. Factories in America could face layoffs and closures if production costs spiral out of control. This isn't just a theoretical threat, It's an economic time bomb that Washington never saw coming. Keycap 4: Europe's countermove, escalating the trade war against the US. Canada's pivot to Europe wasn't an isolated event, it was part of a larger movement that saw the European Union taking a harder stance against US trade policies. Small Diamond EU President Ursula von der Leyen and French President Emmanuel Macron immediately backed Canada's stance, warning that the EU would retaliate aggressively if the US continued imposing unfair tariffs. Small Diamond: the European Commission began drafting countermeasures, including new tariffs on American goods, targeting products that would politically and economically hurt the US. Blocking US firms from bidding on billion-dollar European public contracts. Imposing stricter regulations on American tech giants like Google, Apple, and Meta. Small Diamond: Germany, one of the world's largest auto producers, also took action, proposing heavy tariffs on American-made cars, making them even less competitive in the European market. At this point, the US had two choices: continue down its path of economic isolation, worsening its trade war with both Canada and the EU. Reconsider its aggressive tariff policies before irreparable damage is done to the US auto industry. Keycap 5: A New World Order, is America losing its trade dominance? Washington had always assumed that allies like Canada and the EU would fall in line, that economic dependency would keep them bound to US policies. But this trade war has exposed a new reality. America is no longer the sole architect of global trade. Countries like Canada and powerful blocs like the EU are building independent economic alliances, reducing their reliance on Washington. The US auto industry is dangerously exposed, with supply chains disrupted and raw materials becoming more expensive. American carmakers are losing their competitive edge to European automakers. The global trade structure is shifting. If the US continues alienating its allies, it risks isolating itself from the very economic networks that made it a superpower in the first place. The question now is, will Washington acknowledge this shift and change its course? Or will it double down on economic nationalism, even if it means further weakening its own industries? One thing is certain, this trade battle is far from over. Keycap 6: Europe's retaliation plan against the USA calculated counterattack. The European Union is not merely observing this trade conflict, it is actively preparing a full-scale economic counteroffensive against the US. The EU has extensive strategic retaliation tools at its disposal. And if Washington thought it could impose tariffs without consequences, Brussels is ready to prove otherwise. French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have issued stark warnings. The EU will not tolerate unfair trade policies and will strike back harder if necessary. The EU's multi-layered response includes tariffs on politically sensitive American goods. Europe will target US industries that are deeply tied to influential voting regions, such as bourbon, hurting Kentucky-based distilleries, a Republican stronghold; orange juice, impacting Florida's citrus industry, another key electoral state; motorcycles, directly harming companies like Harley-Davidson, which has historically supported American manufacturing; blocking US firms from lucrative European contracts. American companies will be barred from bidding on billion-dollar EU infrastructure and service projects, cutting off a major revenue stream for firms like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and General Electric. Regulatory crackdowns on American tech giants. Companies such as Google, Apple, Netflix, Meta, and Amazon are already under scrutiny for data privacy and antitrust violations. Brussels could intensify these regulatory hurdles, making it far more difficult for Silicon Valley firms to operate profitably in the European market. Reviving a long-dormant digital services tax, DST, originally postponed due to US pressure. The DST could now be reinstated specifically to target American tech companies. If enacted, this tax could cost US firms billions in additional fees, reducing their dominance in the global digital marketplace. Restricting US pharmaceutical and agricultural exports. Washington has long relied on the European market for the export of American-made prescription drugs and agricultural products. If Brussels chooses to impose strict regulations or additional duties on these sectors, it could cripple U.S. pharmaceutical firms and farmers, causing domestic prices to spike. This is no longer a one-sided trade battle. If Washington insists on imposing economic pressure, the EU is proving it has the power and influence to make the US feel the pain. Keycap 7 Canada and the EU strengthen trade ties, a new economic bloc emerges. While Washington isolates itself with its tariff policies, Canada and the European Union are forging a stronger economic alliance, one that may permanently shift global trade dynamics. Small Diamond, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the EU is being reinforced. This deal already eliminates 98% of tariffs on traded goods between Canada and Europe. But recent developments are expanding its scope even further. Small Diamond key trade policies between Canada and the EU now include easier market access for Canadian businesses. The EU has streamlined processes for Canadian companies, making it simpler and cheaper for them to operate in European markets. Financial support for Canadian exporters. Both Ottawa and Brussels are providing subsidies and tax incentives to encourage Canadian firms to prioritize trade with Europe over the US. Critical mineral partnerships. With global demand for rare minerals skyrocketing due to the electric vehicle (EV) revolution, Canada and the EU are now collaborating to secure stable supply chains for nickel, aluminum, and uranium. The goal? Reduce reliance on the US and China, ensuring that Canada and Europe control their own energy and technology future. Job mobility agreements. For decades, skilled professionals from Canada have struggled with European work regulations. Now, new agreements will make it easier for engineers, architects, and accountants to work across EU borders. This move directly competes with the US for top talent, potentially drawing professionals away from American job markets. Washington once viewed the Canada-EU economic relationship as secondary. That is no longer the case. The stronger this alliance grows, the more isolated and vulnerable the US becomes. Keycap 8 Canada's strategy: breaking free from US dependency. For years, Canada's economy has been heavily dependent on the United States. That dependency is now being strategically dismantled. Small Diamond Canada is accelerating its trade diversification efforts, ensuring that no single country, including the US, can dictate its economic fate. Small Diamond. 3 key pillars of Canada's new strategy include financial aid for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Canada is allocating billions in funding to help local businesses expand into international markets beyond the US. A post-COVID digital trade revolution. Canada has ramped up e-commerce initiatives, virtual trade shows, and digital marketing grants, making it easier for Canadian companies to build customer bases outside of North America. A massive $4 billion investment into critical mineral production, recognizing that minerals like lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements will define the future of clean energy. Canada is establishing itself as a global leader in sustainable mining. Instead of exporting these resources to the US, Canada is focusing on supplying the EU and other strategic partners. In other words, Canada is no longer willing to be an economic junior partner to Washington. This is a full-scale transformation, one that the US may not be able to reverse. Keycap 9 The bigger picture: a global trade realignment. This isn't just about steel, or aluminum, or even cars. This is about power. Canada and the European Union are leading a global shift away from US trade dominance, a shift that has profound consequences for Washington's long-term influence. Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen the US economy, but they have instead pushed its closest allies to seek new economic alliances. If Washington continues its aggressive trade policies, the long-term consequences could include a permanently weakened US auto industry, as Canadian materials flow to Europe instead. American car manufacturers face rising costs and global competition they may not be able to withstand. A diminished role for US tech companies, if the EU clamps down on Google, Apple, and Amazon. The dominance of American big tech could erode over time. A new economic order where the US is no longer the central player, as countries begin reducing their reliance on American markets. Washington's leverage over global trade will gradually diminish. The EU and Canada are sending a clear message. If the US chooses economic warfare, it will face economic consequences. Washington has long operated under the belief that it can impose tariffs without repercussions, that smaller nations will always comply and that allies will always return to the negotiating table. That assumption no longer holds true. The US may still be the world's largest economy, but size alone does not guarantee control. And as Canada and the EU continue to forge new paths without Washington, one question remains. Can the US afford to keep fighting a trade war it may no longer be able to win? Is the US making a fatal mistake by alienating its closest trade allies? Or will Washington find a way to recover from this growing economic realignment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more updates on this ongoing global power shift. A trade war that could redefine global power. The United States entered this trade battle believing its dominance was unshakable. It assumed that Canada and the EU, bound by economic dependency, would eventually concede to Washington's aggressive tariff policies. But instead of surrendering, Canada and the EU have rewritten the rules of global trade. By forging a stronger economic alliance, Canada has broken free from its reliance on the US, while the EU has positioned itself as a powerful counterforce to American economic aggression. This isn't just about tariffs anymore, it's a realignment of global influence. A shift that could permanently weaken the US auto industry and beyond. Yet, even as Washington grapples with the consequences of its own decisions, a crucial question remains. Will the US adapt, or will it cling to outdated strategies, further isolating itself in a world that is moving forward without it? The future of this trade war is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the days of uncontested American economic supremacy are fading. The world is changing. The question is, can Washington change with it? What do you think? Is the US losing its grip on global trade? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.